So let's get going. So today for Nam Academy, we're going to talk about something that I've been talking more about these days. There's a lot of things about fragmentation of the personality. So if this is the personality, what does trauma actually do? What does, a big ACE score, adverse childhood experiences, what does it actually do to a person? Lots of different ways to understand it. We can talk about amygdala, we can talk about survival mind, frontal cortex, we can talk. So this is a way of talking about it. And I want to sort of talk about both the problem, why people get hung up, and also the road towards the solution. If you can just bring that for me, if someone can just bring that little sign, that because everything we're going to talk about today is related to this, which is the onion. I always like talking about the onion, and so maybe I'll just push this back so the onion can be seen. The thing is, fragmentation of the personality. That's kind of what happens. There's lots of words for this, but the biggest buzzword is dissociation. Dissociation equals fragmentation of the personality. And this is the single biggest entity that people try their best. They do all the yoga, they do all the stuff, and they just don't make the progress. They don't move as fast as they should. They pray lots, they go to lots of AA or whatever, family support groups, and they just don't quite make the progress. And so usually when I hear that kind of story, it's this that's happening. It's dissociation. Dissociation is fragmentation of the personality, and it is, it kind of looks like this. So if this is the whole, complete, that's healthy, that's how you're born. I should say that's how you're conceived, because the pre-birth trauma does exist, so, depending on what happens in the womb, this process unfortunately can start even in there. But for the most part, we're born relatively whole. Not very sophisticated, but over time, we learn ways to cope that involve turning away. So something unbearable happens, there's inadequate support. That's the definition of trauma. You need three things. You need so for traumatization to actually occur, you need three conditions to be met. Two of the three won't do it. It has to be all three. You have to have negative thing or unwelcome thing. You have to have inadequate support internally. Usually leads to hopelessness, helplessness. But even that's not enough. You have to have also inadequate external support. So, my writing is not that easy to read, but the point is, you have to have these three conditions. When you have any negative event that happens and these three conditions are met, then what that represents is suffering that's not going away. And so what we have to do is we have to still get up the next day, go make our lunch. We still have to function. We can't not function. So we have to live with the suffering, and the way we do that is we set up a territory in the mind where that suffering lives. We compartmentalize it, and then we go on with our day. We live over here. It's 90%, It's not quite, so 10% shoved away, but hey, 90% is pretty good. Let's get going. Just don't think about anything related to that, and we're good. The trouble is, especially when this happens as children, we can't really necessarily avoid it, especially if traumatizing things are parents, people close to us. And so what happens is it tends to happen again and again. More and more territories get carved out because more and more things happen where these criteria are met. And over time, every time we actually learn, hey, this is a fantastic way to cope. It works really good. Because you know what? It turns out we don't actually need much of our brain to live day to day, 5%. So that's like a ton of brain. You can shove a lot of stuff in there. We can understand this through subconscious garbage can. Today we're understanding it through brain maps or mind maps. But you can continue this process of compartmentalizing and forgetting. Stick it under the rug, forget about it. Stick it under the rug. And internally what happens is you continue to sort of create these territories. The longer this goes on, the more firm these territories get. The more things that go on, the more of these territories are made, and then the more the more toxic these things are, and the longer it goes on, the more firm the boundaries become. What you have to understand is these boundaries, whenever you dissociate a part of the body or mind, it actually begins to operate as an independent mind. It's like a seed. You plant a seed, it becomes a plant. You plant another seed, it becomes a plant. It doesn't just stay a seed. Even though it's part of the same plant, it becomes its own plant, unique to its own nature. Maybe it has 5 branches instead of 4. Maybe it has 10 leaves instead of 11. And so whenever you carve out part of your brain, it starts to take on a mind of its own. So the longer these things happen, the more people are likely to develop parts of self that operate more and more autonomously. And so, this could be, for example, there could be a suicidal part. There could be an angry part. There could be a really shameful part. There's ways of understanding these parts. There could be parts that just hold a lot of painful memories. And what happens as time goes on, more and more of these parts come up. And they have many characteristics, so we'll just use Roman numerals. And over time, you get more and more of these, and the more complex the upbringing, the more complex the issues, the more and more of these parts that develop, the more stress there is, the more concrete these barriers become, until you're in this kind of state where you're living out of a portion of your mind that's functioning. It has to function, so we can call this in trauma language, they call this the ANP, the apparently normal personality. So this part has to kind of live life. The thing is it's avoiding any triggers related to any of these parts. Because anytime it encounters a certain kind of trigger, such as not being listened to, angry, suicidal parts come up, ruin your day for a week, make it so you can't work, you can't do anything, and so all of a sudden this part knows it can't feed the self unless it avoids situations where people don't listen. It has to avoid that, which is really tough because, functioning in a job, you got to take feedback. Sometimes you get a boss who doesn't listen all the time. If that results in the activation of all this stuff, there's a lot of jobs this person's not going to be able to do. The nature of traumatization is avoidance. So someone comes to us, they've developed this. This is another way to understand this is complex PTSD. And you know what? One of the symptoms of our society's classification of mental illness is addiction is overly simplified. Oh, it's just alcoholism. Actually, behind every alcoholism is this. I've not encountered not this. Before, when I was only just an addiction doctor, that's what I thought. It was just a bunch of drunks, it's not that complicated. But actually, once they get sober, it's all there. A lot of times, parts don't get along with each other, and there's friction, out of which comes extreme emotion, which impairs sleep. So people drink to go to sleep, for example. So by the time people come to see us, usually there's less of the mind that's consolidated, a lot of fragmentation. This is very energetically inefficient. As time goes on, one interesting thing happens is the mind becomes leaky because the blood vessels get clogged. Even infants age, everyone ages. And so as the brain loses capacity, previously well-stored, hidden away things become leaky. And they start leaking. Sometimes people hit their heads. A person like this who hits their head is going to have a big problem because they're disrupting decades of carefully laid neuronal infrastructure, much like a city that gets hit by an earthquake. It's not very pretty. If you go to, what was that, Kathmandu? No, not Kathmandu. Yeah, it was Nepal, right? Kathmandu? Yeah. Yes. So that city, 50% of it got leveled by an earthquake. And I assure you, the other 50% wasn't well organized after that. Bridges and stuff that you need to go from earthquakes are a big deal. But if you think of a concussion and complex PTSD, that's kind of what happens. And unfortunately, a lot of these traumatizing things also involve head injuries. And that just accelerates the leakiness. So at NOM, we're very interested in trauma because we know that the brain becomes leaky over time. And so it's only going to get worse. And that's what we see. Addiction only gets worse in time. Behavioral problems only get worse in time unless they're addressed. There is always an escalation because everything ages and your brain is no different. This is when we get triggered, all of these other things can be understood as what we call an emotional personality. And when we get triggered, we actually lose. So if there's a trigger, trigger. Amygdala, as you've learned, it gets activated. Amygdala activated. This part kind of goes away, and suddenly the EP takes over. Depending on the part, if it's a suicidal part, suddenly it comes out. Life's ending, may as well just end it now, it's better that way. These intrusive, unending thoughts come up. Or maybe angry person comes up. Or maybe shame person comes up. And it's almost overwhelming when that switch happens. The more complex the PTSD, the more concrete the switch is, and the harder it is to switch back. And so the thing is that it's all related to triggers. So when we get triggered, the main part tends to go offline, and another part tends to become activated. And that part is usually a heck of a lot younger, so like 8 years old, 10 years old. But this part is like 40. An 8-year-old doesn't do a good job in the 40-year-old body. And so you make a mess of it. So the thing is that that's the reason why this person, this apparently known person, is going to avoid triggers, because every time they get triggered, an 8-year-old is driving the car. You might have seen road rage, right? He cut me off. I followed him home and I trashed his headlights. I assure you it was not a 40-year-old that did all that. It was an 8-year-old, because that's what 8-year-olds would do. But the 40-year-old gets charged with aggravated assault, goes to jail. And so the alcohol and mood-altering substances just make this transition go a lot faster and easier. And that's why it's not great. So, this is dissociation. A lot of times, people come to us seemingly normal, seemingly very well-intentioned. They want to get better. But they only do recovery with this part. So 80% of the fragmented mind is not online. It's not present. It's tucked away when they're doing the groups, the therapy. They're doing the courses. They want to get recovered, but all these parts are still tucked away. And actually the nature of dissociation is if they're tucked away, they don't hear it. A lot of times, let's say I talk to a suicidal part. Is it 2020? No, it's not 2020. It's actually 1995. It's actually 2022. What? This is a very common conversation I have with parts of self when we engage in some ego state therapy. So these parts are locked away in time. They contain immense emotional pain. They can be triggered at any time, and as time goes on, they get triggered more and more often, which makes life more unmanageable. And when you're trying to do things to heal them, the very nature of dissociation is to hide. That's how it works. That's the theory of it. Is that hurts, shove it away, forget about it. And so its very nature is to hide. And that's why people recover. They try their best, they do their prayers, but only 30% of the person's praying. 70% of the person's not hearing it, not feeling it. That's dissociation. And it's very common. Dissociation can be in your body, unexplained medical symptoms, pain, back pain, knee pain. You can have dissociation in sort of like certain symptoms like suicidality. You can have dissociation in many, many, many ways. You can even forget. This part could actually be incognito. Oftentimes, late in therapy is the only time when parts come out. You've been doing therapy 10 years, and only late in the game, oh, hey, there's this part there. It's been incognito this whole time. Some parts of self actually think that they're outside of you. They're walking behind you. Oftentimes, those parts hold all the pain. They're walking behind you, so they're not with you. The therapist talking to you, they're not talking to that part. And this sounds crazy, but it's reality. Trauma literature is pretty clear that this is a very real phenomenon. So, the mind is organized in this way. Most people who've suffered a lot of adversity, their mind becomes organized in this way. So what do we do about it? And I think that that's only possible to do something about it if we understand that what's there. I don't need you to believe me. Don't believe anything I say. But talk to yourself when you're upset. Ask yourself some questions. How old am I? How old are you right now? And just see what answer comes up. and you'll start to convince yourself that these parts are very disconnected from reality. And the reality is you flip in and out of this, unless you're aware of it, 20 times an hour. When you say this much, like a paragraph, a sentence of that could be from this part, another sentence could be from that part, 5 sentences from there, 1 sentence from there. It's all mixed. That's because it's not like you're just living out of this. A lot of people, they don't make progress in therapy because they think this is their whole self. So that's the awareness piece. And what do we do in therapy? And then how do we heal this? Because that's really what it's about. So we heal, and then we'll do an exercise with this. But inevitably, no matter what the trauma therapy is, no matter what road to therapy it is, whether it's a religious road, whether it's a 12-step road, whether it's a therapist road, whether it's EMDR, whatever, the road to healing is always the same, and it begins like this. It usually begins with the discovery of this really cool blue part that everyone has, which we'll just call high resource state. HRS. I just made that up, but let's call it HRS. Okay? Everyone has this cool blue part. It may be bigger, it may be smaller. Every human has an intrinsic ability to heal. If you don't believe me, just think of the last time you cut yourself and ask yourself, what did you do to heal? And the answer is probably nothing. The wound probably just started healing. Or maybe you went to a doctor, maybe you got a Band-Aid, maybe you got a cast. But every human has that ability to heal. Wound healing is so sophisticated we can't create it in a lab. And so every human has, similarly, it kind of makes sense that there's a mental healing system, there's a social healing system, there is a spiritual healing system to repair damage. And so, if that's actually true, then we should all possess these parts of self, or these aspects of self, that are able to heal other damage. And lo and behold, when we do trauma work, this is what we're doing. So when you're learning to meditate, you're learning ways to feel good, you're praying or you're doing something, what happens is you, through whatever lineage, you pull yourself into this high resource state, and it feels good for a while. It feels nice. And then when you stop, you go back into this. And it doesn't feel so good. In fact, this is so common that people stop doing any kind of therapy work because it feels good for a while and it doesn't feel good. It feels good to meditate, it feels good to go on vacation, it feels good to sort of go to the yoga studio, but then when you come home, it's lost, seemingly. So what we do, what's happening is that person who's fragmented is accessing something, but when they're accessing it, they're just in it, and they're in it alone. No other part is accessing this. And so then the healing is restricted. It's restricted to just what happens in that time period. So there's a couple of interesting aspects to the mind. One is that the mind acts like Google. So when you're in, let's say you're ocean breathing. You're breathing in as the water comes in, breathing out as the water moves away. and you're just kind of feeling good, you're in nature. A lot of people like going to nature for this reason. Nature oftentimes allows them to access this HRS, high resource state, and then they wish they could just live there because it's so nice. It's away from all the, complications of life, and it feels nice. What needs to happen is that boundary of that high resource state, it needs to be grown. It needs to actually expand and encompass more and more of the mind. And we do that. We do that in all sorts of ways. For example, something we do in our resources for recovery group on Thursdays is we create, or we introduce you to ways that you can create a high resource state. If your high resource state is just this little circle, gotta expand it, gotta build it. Daily practice will do that. And the thing is that we just have to expand more and more this space. And that's actually a really simple thing, but if you don't do it, it doesn't get done. It doesn't matter if you meditate for 40 years. If you don't use your high resource state to actually heal anything, it doesn't get healed. And so a lot of times in therapy, we say, okay, you're kind of, the therapist will guide some of this. But actually healing's a lot older than therapy. So like we've been healing as a human race for millennia, many millennia. There's a lot of ways, and they all really use the mind as Google. So one thing that you can do is when you're in a high resource state, if you know of a neighboring territory that you're struggling with, you can just gently ask, hey, I wonder what it would be like to kind of heal. You can just gently access something when you're in that space. High resource state and access something. Every time you do it, it'll solidify the connection, much like a river. And at some point, the connection will become so stable that the high resource state flows and maybe enters a part of this. And then, when that's consolidated and adjustments have happened, you can just repeat again. Build another bridge. Build another bridge. Until it's stable. So you're just doing your ocean breathing, doing your meditating, whatever that thing is, create a stable bridge, and then the high resource state will kind of enter that too. And over time, you can actually get faster and better at it. So that, as a doctor, what got me into trauma therapy is that this work is permanent. Once it's done, it can't be undone. And that the whole works better together. There's less pain and more satisfaction, as one person said. When the whole is not controlling the body separately, but the whole is controlling the self collaboratively. So you don't lose parts of self, and there's no loss. It's not about getting rid of parts of self at all. It's about unifying and collaborating. Like kind of, we talk in IOP about the boat. You have got your rowers, And if everyone's rowing in their own direction, the boat's spinning. But if everyone's rowing in the same direction and has a say as to where the boat goes, then everyone's happy. So how do we actually do this? And then we'll actually do a bit of practice with this. So we have to access a high resource state. That takes practice. There's lots of ways you can do that. Go to a yoga class. If you're into like church choir, it's a fantastic place to gather energy. Go and pray. There's many, many ways. I'm not going to talk about high resource states today. We have lots of teachings on high resource states. Thursday group at 4 o'clock. That's what that group is all about. The thing is what do you do inside a high resource state? You can set an intention. You can ask that high resource state to simply, hey, can you heal this block that I got going on that's keeping me from being lazy, that's keeping me from doing this thing? Just that self-inquiry is enough. It's enough to set up a short bridge. Just that in that feeling good space, and that's very counterintuitive, right? We want to feel good. We don't want to think about the not so good when we're feeling good, because what's the point? But the goal here is to expand territory so that we can have more and more of our mind permanently unified, with less distraction, less randomness, less trigger avoidance. This is what we want. Well, if we want that, we got to take our one high resource state that we have and we got to move it, and we got to access lower resource states in the high resource state. And we can do that simply by Googling our mind. You can ask yourself, hey, you know what? Can you heal that memory from yesterday? Bugs me. Unless you ask, it doesn't happen, because the nature of the mind is that barriers have been set up. That memory that bothers you has stacked with a previous memory, and it's been stored somewhere that's tucked away. Unless you access it, it will be hidden, because that's how you're programmed. But you can do it. You can absolutely do it. You need to be guided by your intuition. So your mind works like Google. Can you heal one little bit of it that's safe enough for me to heal today? Which might not be very much, because you might be unstable. There's nothing wrong with intention setting. Some people, if their high resource state is like God and Jesus, they call that a prayer. If your high resource state is just super bliss when you're meditating, call it whatever you like. Call it core self, call it your highest self, call it deep self. Call it whatever you like, but you can access that state and you can ask it questions, much like you can ask any of these other part questions. And repetitively, through a daily practice, you're meditating, you're doing flash, you're getting calm, you're getting zen, take a little bit of time and just access that. And see if you can do a little bit of healing, because whatever you do is going to be quite permanent. And so, iteratively, over time, you get better and better. You can subject more and more pain to this process. I'm not saying go and dredge up your deepest, darkest things, but you can actually use the high resource state to expand. And you can target the things day to day that are bugging you. Everyone has blocks to recovery. Whatever that's blocking me today, this is a good one, good intention to set. Whatever that's blocking me today, please heal that and a little bit of the roots of that, wherever that is. I don't need to know. And that's the cool thing about that. So some people, they in recovery, they say, I just feel lazy all the time. So laziness can become a target. The roots of laziness are usually very many. Laziness is oftentimes rooted in many places. the vast majority of places where these things are rooted are unknown. And actually, as a trauma therapist, I'll say I never know. Where I think they're rooted at the beginning of our work together and where they actually end up being are always different. I never know. And the person never knows. They're always shocked. What? I've been short of breath my whole life, and it was because of something I don't remember that happened when I was 6 months. That happens. We processed it with Flash, and then she wasn't short of breath anymore. But who knew? I didn't know. She didn't know either. The thing is that symptoms are rooted in places where you don't know. What we know about symptoms is they can be rooted anywhere. They can be rooted in the body. A lot of times, one of the ways that we can embody the self, a lot of times trauma is actually stored in the body. And so people cope by living in the mind mostly. And so the trauma comes out in the way of pain in the body. So the trauma can be stored in the pain, it can be in the body, it can be stored in the organs, it can be kind of chakra things. There's a lot of lineages. There's meridians can be blocked. If you're into like past lives, some people believe that. It can be intergenerational. It can be sort of memories that you don't remember. It could be inner children that are hurt, that you're unconscious of. It can be children you are conscious of but avoiding. There's like 30 different areas, and probably a lot more, where the roots of these things can be. But because the mind works like Google, you can just say the word root. And it suddenly accesses all of them in a very distant way. So you can say whatever the root of this laziness is, I don't need to know, but if you can send a bit of healing energy that way, that'd be great. That's it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, do it again tomorrow. Meaning, don't believe anything I say. Pick something simple and just see if it actually works. Enter a high resource state, get feeling really, really good, and then just say something like that. Targets the root of something. Don't pick your worst memory. Please don't pick your worst memory. Just pick something simple. And just see. Because at the end of the day, self-therapy is about self-healing. The more powerful your resource state, so some states, for example, a religious mantra, can get you extremely elevated. Whatever your views on all that is, those mantras and those affirmations and those choir things can get you extremely elevated. And so you can actually do quite a bit of work in that. Most people don't. That's why religious parents oftentimes traumatize their kids, because they're traumatized and they sort of pass on the trauma related to religion. But really, these high resource states need to be cultivated. Many ways to do it: nature, spirit animals. There's all sorts of ways you can cultivate high resource states. Sometimes we use a gong, which we'll do today. But the thing is that what you do in that state is what will help you take back and reconsolidate the mind. And you must do that to whatever little bit you can tolerate. Don't outsource your healing to anyone other than you. Us therapists, we're not that special. We're only here to help you with blocks. The rest of it is you. And actually you're more than enough. You can do lens, you can do other things that can help the reactivity, help increase your window of tolerance. But no one can do this for you. And in this, no one can do this for you. These are things you actually want. So you ought to be willing to give up the pain. You got to be willing to actually want to change. Sometimes that's the block. Well, guess what? You can set the intention for that too. High resource state, please grant me the willingness to want change, or help me with the resistance or the roots of that. The mind works like Google. You can put anything into it, and some things will work, some things won't. Be an experimenter. It's your mind. You know, in Canada, mental health crisis is pretty bad, right? You can't make it much worse than it is when you have all these overdoses and suicides and left, right, and center. And I see a lot of hope. As a doctor, I love trauma work because it's permanent. Just like I love treating urinary tract infections. It's not very glorious, but man, when you get the right antibiotic, you hit that UTI and it gets cured and the patient's like, oh, doctor, I feel great. It feels awesome. So the mind is like that too, if you unblock it. And if you cultivate these states. Journaling. Some people, what they do, if you're into the God thing, some people, one lady, she told me she has a two-way prayer. So she asks God questions, and then she just writes the answers that come out. And what she's doing is she's engaging with a high resource state. And through that collaborative daily process, she's expanding her territory. She's integrating. It's a beautiful practice. You have to make it your own. Irrespective of what your beliefs are, everyone has the intrinsic core self-state that you can manifest and experience. It's just about discovering it. And sometimes therapists can help you, introduce you to it, which is a lot of what we do at NOM. Just remembering that healing always happens in layers. Discovery of these states, sometimes it's unbearable. I remember one guy, we discovered a state, and then it took him a lot of time to just even be okay with that. And then over time it grew, and then he was able to use it for various things. So that's dissociation, and that's generally what we do as therapists with trauma therapy. I let the cats out of the bag now. Trauma therapists oftentimes cost $300 an hour. But this is what we do. In self-therapy, you're increasing your capacity to do little bits of this. A therapist, yes, when you're with a therapist, you can do a heck of a lot more, and it's good. But don't disempower yourself. In your daily prayer, if you pray every day, a little bit of this can be done, and you might surprise yourself. So, at the very least, you can ask for the stress of today to become manageable, and just prove it to yourself. And if it's not your thing, then just forget about it. But this is a theory. If I've misspoken, my humblest apologies. And I'm just going to pause and we'll get to a question. If you want to record it, then you can just write it down. But otherwise, we'll start with you over there.
Yes, doctor. What part of brain is this? Conscious, subconscious, or?
This is, that's a good question. So what we talk about, anatomy, we talk about physiology, there's a many number of ways to understand the mind because it's a very complex thing. This is a mind map.
All right.
So this is, if I were to use a conscious, subconscious, I would say this is, subconscious isn't just straight up a garbage can. It's a beautiful thing, but the subconscious is organized in a certain way. This is just a way to understand it. It's not the only way to understand it. So a lot of this activity is happening subconsciously. But then it comes into consciousness. So you can think of this as a way of storing information. In fact, in trauma therapy, we call it DSI. Dysfunctionally stored information. When information is stored in this way, it's called dysfunctionally stored information. It's not neutral. It's stored in a way that it can come out at any moment with the right trigger. So DSI is how it's stored. This conscious subconscious paradigm, that's a way of thinking that you'll find more in kind of yoga and those understandings.
I'm coming on that, yes.
This is more from a psychological trauma therapy perspective of how the mind is organized. Both are valid. They're just different words. But for talking about dissociation, this is a better way to look at it. To understand the fragmentation of the mind, much like the fragmentation of a country, a country or Europe. You know, it's a map, different territories, different people, different languages, but all human. So this is why we use this. Answer the question?
Yes, sir. And second thing, doctor, so far tapping is concerned, I go to hot tub and steam room lot. In steam room, I do tapping
Okay.
and triple blinking as well.
Good.
And my style is, I'll tell you, Ek Onkar, Satnam, Karta Pokshne
Yeah.
Pone Murta Juni Saban Gurprasad Jap. I don't go further, but it goes longer.
Mm-hmm.
So far, whole moon mantra is.
Yes.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
So
7,
I'll make
8,
a comment.
9, and 5.
Mm-hmm. I'll make a comment on this.
Yes.
So what you're talking about is you're accessing a high resource state. So you go into the steam room. So steam room is a place of safety. It feels good. You do tapping. That calms you down. You do flash. That processes distracting things. So every time you do flash, you end up processing a little bit. That's why we like flash.
Yes.
Flash as a daily practice will help you expand and take tiny little shaves off of this. So over time as a daily practice, because we're triggered every day, every trigger has its roots in the past. You use flash, every time you're triggered you access a whole bunch of it, and in layers you shed it. It may take you years, but hey, it's free. Doesn't cost you anything other than time. So what you do is you tap. You go to a place, a steam room, you feel relaxed, you feel good.
Yes.
You add your mantra, that makes you even more high resource. And so that's really, really good. A lot of times, if you're angry, for example, you've switched into this part of self, and you do tapping, that's expanding this into this. It's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do every day, and it's a good thing to do especially when you're triggered. Over time, with practice, you'll actually become very good at this, to the point where you become excited when these feelings come up, because, hey, I have an opportunity. So at the beginning, every day, every moment is unmanageable, lots of pain, lots of avoidance, lots of stuff. But as you get more and more whole, you'll actually like it getting triggered. I love getting triggered. It doesn't happen often, but when it happens, I use it as like, oh, hey, I must have missed a little point somewhere. And the trigger tells me, hey, okay, go after that. Nobody can access all of this and consolidate it all at once. So when the triggers happen, they tell you where healing is needed. That's why that's one of the principles.
And
So I'm just going to pause you. We'll come back to you. We had one other comment.
I don't know if I can remember it. I have memory block issues. It had something to do with the trauma stored in the body. And I can't remember what it is though.
Oh, that's totally okay.
Like toothache, for example. Like I noticed yesterday after I was doing like processing, and then I did like meditation to get to my higher resource state. And I felt like there was a lot of pain, but then there was a lot of gratitude and happiness, because I felt like there was a process that was coming to a head there.
Mm-hmm.
But then after, now I'm noticing like toothache and nausea and headache and stuff. So I don't know, like, okay, there's another layer of the onion, but more investigating, I guess.
A lot of times we store things in the body, and we live in the head, and we become more and more numb to what our body is saying. And so the body actually has to give a harsh symptom to become known, such as bloating, such as nausea, such as pain. And one of the ways that we teach a lot about at NAM, when you're doing any kind of recovery, embodying yourself in with the breath, breathing consciously, you have to bring yourself into the body in order to breathe consciously. And so practicing that will over time give you greater awareness of your triggers. Because a lot of times, sometimes you get bothered, you blow up and you think it's this thing, but actually you were triggered from 5 hours ago. and you were unable to sense it. A lot of anger management classes, they talk a lot about early detection, and that's why. But it's really hard to do without embodiment. Embodiment is a lecture unto itself. In fact, I may or may not have done a lecture. I think I did actually on breathing. I talk about it in that one. So it's very common, and it's absolutely a layer. The question is how long does it take? And the answer is as long as it takes. People are on journeys for decades of their life, for months, for years, for decades. But however long it took you to get here is not how long it takes you to get better. Some people have been on a journey long before they come here. So the point is just your journey is your journey. It will be unique to you. Every recovery decision you make, if you have a better map that tells you how things are laid out, you might get there a bit faster. So today I'm just trying to give you a big hint.
Is it sort of like the ego mind taking over when you start to notice that it's like, is it sort of like the body disassociating pain that you're not wanting to look at right now, and that's why it's starting to come out? Like, because I didn't have, like I had other bodily sensations that were illness or whatever. But I found that yesterday doing some really deep, higher resource state processing, then I had some other like pains within my body, and then I'm starting to ask myself the question, is this like my ego trying to distract me from the journeying, that's the painful journeying, or is this something that is a new layer of something of awareness about myself that I need to learn, that's an area maybe that has trauma that I haven't had the courage to look under that stone yet?
It's all things. A lot of times parts of self are worried about being forgotten, and so the more you kind of talk about things, the more activated it gets. It may not be conscious, but it's getting more and more activated. So, and if it's stored in your body somewhere, maybe you start getting a bit of chest pain or something, and it makes sense, right? If you're this territory, you're worried. Hey, what's this blue stuff? It's taking me over. No, I'm gonna fight. But if you just kind of raise awareness gently, hey, no one's. That's part of why I'm talking how I'm talking. No, it's not about. You can't get rid of any member of your team. Your mental, physiological, psychological team, the players, all of it. You can't get rid of none of it. It's all you, it's all important, whether you like it, whether you don't like it. It's on the team, and it's there to stay. It's about retraining. So if there's some parts that are unhappy, worried about recovery, that's very normal. Very normal. It's about the repetitive reassurance process. And there's sometimes one-on-one time with a therapist can assist in that. So it's very natural. We're all like that, right? We learn something new. A new boss comes, new direction. Am I going to have a job or not? Am I going to, even though it might be positive, it might be really good change, there's worry, right? And so change, when you've been stuck in a certain way of thinking, is always threatening. And so that can manifest in bodily symptoms. And what's what? It's a very complex mental, emotional system. That's one of the things these days that has happened is we simplify mental illness. And it's always just a bit of depression, a little bit of chemical imbalance. Humans are not simple. We didn't come to be in this space because of simple things. It's complicated. And any overly simple change, even what I'm suggesting today, this isn't a fix. It's a process. It's a unique process. It's of principles that can guide you towards healing. So thank you for the comment. I think we're going to close it off for there. Unless there's anything else burning, I'm just going to stop it though. Thank you.